All right, let's jump into this deep dive and take a closer look at what's happening in Ukraine. We've got some interesting stuff to go over today, especially when it comes to the possibility of negotiations and how the rest of the world is reacting to this conflict.
Yeah, things are definitely changing, that's for sure. One thing that really stands out from all this is how the new leadership in the U.S. seems to be having a big impact globally, especially regarding the situation in Ukraine.
Absolutely. It's like the whole tone has shifted, almost like a reset on how the U.S. wants to approach things.
Exactly. There's this noticeable difference between what we're seeing now and the very public stance the previous administration took. For example, there are reports about these behind-the-scenes talks happening between U.S. and Russian officials.
Wait, behind-the-scenes talks? That's a huge change from how things were done before. I mean, it seemed like everything was very out in the open, like they were really trying to show a united front. But these private discussions, well, it makes you wonder what they're talking about, doesn't it? And what does this all mean for Ukraine's role in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question. One analysis even suggests that Ukraine might be left out of these talks entirely. Can you imagine that? After all this time, all the promises of support, decisions about their future might be made without them even being at the table.
It's kind of a scary thought when you really think about it. And speaking of changing things, it seems like the international support for Ukraine might not be as rock solid as it seemed at first.
You're right on the money there. There are signs that the initial unified response is starting to break apart. You can see it in the reports about Germany struggling to get more financial aid for Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's big, especially considering how influential Germany is in Europe. It makes you think other countries might be facing the same problems, maybe feeling the strain of providing constant support.
Definitely. And it goes beyond just the money, right? There's this growing feeling of, I don't know, maybe fatigue towards the conflict, especially in Europe. I mean, the economic consequences are hitting people hard over there. Rising costs, uncertainty about the future. It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, I get it. When a conflict drags on like this, it's only natural for people to start feeling the pressure and wondering what the long-term impact will be on their lives. And to make matters worse, there's this idea floating around that the U.S. might be trying to shift the burden of Ukraine's post-war recovery and security onto Europe. Basically leaving Europe to foot the bill and handle the long-term fallout.
It's one way to look at it, for sure. And it would be a massive responsibility for European nations. It's almost like the U.S. is hinting at taking a step back, not being as involved as they were before.
So we've got potential changes in the U.S. approach, cracks in international support, and this big question mark hanging over who's going to take care of Ukraine in the long run. It's complicated, to say the least.
No doubt about it. And when you look at what's happening on the ground, the reports are pretty bleak. The word from the front lines is that morale among Ukrainian soldiers is dropping, and a lot of them just want out.
That's really tough to hear. I can only imagine how much this is affecting their ability to fight, to keep going when they're under so much pressure.
Absolutely. And then there are these disturbing allegations about foreign fighters, Americans included, being used as cannon fodder. Essentially, they're saying these fighters are being thrown into extremely dangerous situations with almost no chance of survival.
Cannon fodder, that's a harsh term. It implies that they're seen as expendable, just thrown into the conflict without any regard for their lives.
Exactly. And there's one story that really drives this point home. A soldier actually went AWOL after being ordered back to the front lines, even though he was injured. He was literally pulled from the rubble, wounded, and they still told him he had to go back and fight.
Wow, that's just heartbreaking. It really puts into perspective what these soldiers are dealing with, the immense pressure and desperation they're facing every day.
It does. And on the other side of things, some analyses suggest that Russia has been using a very calculated and effective strategy this whole time. Reports say they've managed to take control of several important Ukrainian defensive positions, places like Ugledar, Rakova, Velika Novosilka, you name it.
So while morale might be feeding on the Ukrainian side, it sounds like Russia is making real progress.
That's the picture we're getting. And it looks like they're about to capture Toretsk, which would give them a clear path to Kramatorsk. That's a strategically crucial area.
So we're potentially seeing a swing in momentum on the battlefield, with Russia taking advantage of their advances.
Exactly. And this tactic they're reportedly using, encirclement, seems to be working for them. They're basically forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat and inflicting heavy casualties in the process.
It's a classic military tactic, but when it's done right, it's incredibly effective. And to add another layer of intrigue, there have been some strange developments with North Korean troops.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Reports say they've pulled their troops from the front lines because they've taken such heavy losses. Makes you wonder, was their involvement really as big as everyone thought? And does pulling out mean the dynamics of the conflict are shifting? Or maybe even alliances are changing?
It definitely throws a new wrench into the works.
Yeah, it definitely adds a new wrinkle to things. And amidst all these developments, you have this underlying tension between the story that's being told and what's actually happening on the ground.
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's like there are two completely different narratives playing out. On the one hand, you've got this story about Ukrainian resilience, this idea that they might even win. But then you read reports from the front lines. Morale is plummeting, they're suffering heavy losses, and the soldiers seem disillusioned.
It's a pretty stark contrast. And this gap between the narrative and reality, it's even wider when you consider that the early promises of support and victory, the things that motivated Ukrainians at the start, well, they're leading to a lot of disappointment now that the reality of the situation is setting in.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What was behind those promises in the first place? Did they really believe Ukraine could achieve a decisive victory? Or was there something else going on?
Tough question to answer with any certainty. But one thing's clear. This situation is way more complicated and layered than some of the simplified narratives make it seem.
Right. It's crucial to acknowledge those complexities if we even want to try to understand the potential outcomes of this conflict. And speaking of potential outcomes, let's get back to the possibility of negotiations. We mentioned those rumored talks between the U.S. and Russia, those back-channel discussions. But what does that actually mean in practical terms? What could come out of those talks?
That's the question everyone wants answered. Based on what we're seeing, it looks like the U.S. might be signaling a shift in their strategy, maybe moving away from the idea of a clear Ukrainian victory and towards a negotiated solution.
A negotiated solution. That would be a pretty big change, wouldn't it? For a long time, the focus seemed to be on helping Ukraine get back the territory they lost. But shifting to negotiations means different priorities, maybe even a willingness to compromise to reach a resolution.
You got it. And this change in the U.S. approach is probably influenced by the changing political scene back home. New administrations often reevaluate their foreign policy priorities, and it seems Ukraine might not be top of the list for the current leadership.
Makes sense. And of course, you can't forget about the economic factors. This conflict has put a strain on the global economy, and everyone's feeling the pressure to find a solution that eases that tension.
For sure. The economic pressure is especially intense in Europe, where the war has really messed with energy prices and overall economic stability.
So it seems like a bunch of things are pushing towards some kind of negotiated agreement. But the big question is, what would that look like? What would each side be willing to give up?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, we can't say for sure right now. But based on what we're seeing, any agreement would likely involve some tough compromises for both sides.
Tough compromises. What would that actually entail?
Well, for Ukraine, it could mean accepting the loss of some territory, which would be a bitter pill to swallow after everything they've been through. Think about the emotional weight of a decision like that, the sense of betrayal it might cause.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And what about Russia? What kind of compromises might they have to make?
For them, it could mean scaling back their ambitions, accepting a win that's not nearly as decisive as they might have hoped for at the beginning. It could also involve concessions on things like sanctions relief or recognizing their interests in specific regions.
Sounds like both sides would have to give up something significant to make a deal. But who would be calling the shots? Would it be the U.S. and Russia, based on those secret talks? Or would Ukraine have a seat at the table?
That's a pivotal question, and it gets to the core of Ukraine's sovereignty and right to self-determination. We've already discussed the possibility that they might be left out of these critical negotiations and what that would mean for them.
Yeah, the idea that their fate could be decided without their input, it would set a dangerous precedent, wouldn't it? Imagine fighting so hard for your independence, only to be sidelined when it comes to shaping your own future.
It would be a real blow, and it would send a chilling message to other countries. Smaller nations are just pawns in the games of bigger powers. Their voices don't matter when it comes to global affairs.
Which brings us back to how important it is to understand all the different perspectives on this conflict. Who's controlling the narrative? Whose voices are being amplified? And whose are being silenced or ignored?
Right on. The way this conflict is framed, the stories that are told, and the voices that are heard, all of that will have a huge impact on how it's resolved and the consequences that follow. History is often written by the winners, but in this case, the narrative is still up for grabs even while the fighting continues.
That's a fascinating point. It means there's still room for different viewpoints to be heard, for a more nuanced understanding of the complexities at play.
Exactly. And it's essential that we, as engaged citizens, actively search for those diverse perspectives. We have to challenge our own assumptions and work towards a more informed and compassionate understanding of this critical issue. It's not about picking sides. It's about grappling with the complexities and recognizing the human element of this conflict.
I couldn't agree more. And that human element really comes into focus when you consider the foreign fighters who have joined this conflict. It's a topic that's generated a lot of debate and controversy.
Yeah, it's a topic that often triggers strong feelings and polarizing opinions. On one side, you have the image of these idealistic individuals who are drawn to Ukraine to defend democracy and freedom against an aggressor. But on the other side, there are concerns about what motivates some of these fighters, the potential risks they pose, and the ethics of their involvement.
You're right, it's complicated, and there are no easy answers. It's easy to fall into generalizations, to lump all foreign fighters together. But like with any group of people, the reality is far more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond those simple generalizations and look at the actual situation on the ground. Who are these foreign fighters? What are their backgrounds, their motivations, their experiences in the conflict? Are they seasoned veterans or people with little to no military experience? Are they driven by a strong ideology? Or are there reasons for fighting more personal and complicated?
Those are all essential questions. And from what we're seeing, the picture is a lot more multifaceted than many might assume. We're talking about individuals from all walks of life, from different countries, each with their own unique reasons for joining the fight.
Exactly. Some might be driven by those idealistic motives, wanting to stand up for what they believe is right, defending democracy and freedom against what they see as tyranny. Others might be seeking adventure, maybe a chance to test themselves in combat or escape personal problems back home. And then there are those with personal connections to Ukraine, maybe family ties or a history of conflict with Russia that fuels their desire to fight.
Right. And it's important to remember that these individuals are not a single entity. They come from different backgrounds, hold different beliefs, and have different experiences that have shaped their motivations and how they view this conflict. To just call them all foreign fighters ignores the individual stories that make them who they are.
You said it. And it's those individual stories that can offer the most insightful views into the realities of this conflict. What are their daily lives like on the front lines? What obstacles do they encounter? What are their hopes and fears? What drives them to keep going in the face of such adversity?
You're right. Those personal accounts often cut through all the noise and give us a more grounded human understanding of what's really happening on the ground. And the information we're looking at includes some truly compelling stories from these foreign fighters describing their experiences in vivid detail.
These firsthand accounts are incredibly valuable, and they often challenge the dominant narratives about the conflict. For example, a common theme that emerges is disillusionment among some foreign fighters. They're frustrated by the lack of support, the chaotic nature of the fighting, and the feeling that they're being used as pawns in a larger game. They talk about the brutality of war, the trauma they've witnessed, the loss of comrades, and the psychological toll it's taken on them.
It's a reminder that war is never as clean-cut or straightforward as it seems from a distance. The reality is much more complicated, more chaotic, and full of moral gray areas.
Couldn't agree more. And we need to keep in mind that behind every statistic, every headline, every geopolitical analysis, there are real people with their own stories, their own hopes and dreams, and their own struggles.
Absolutely. Their stories deserve to be heard. So we've talked about the possibility of negotiations, the changing political scene, the shifting narratives, and the experiences of foreign fighters.
Yeah.
But what about the bigger picture? What are the long-term consequences of this conflict for the region and the world?
Yeah, the ultimate question. It's one that people will be debating for years to come, but I think it's safe to say this conflict has already had a major impact on the global order.
Major impact. In what ways?
Well, for one, it's exposed the weaknesses in the international system, the cracks in the idea of global unity that a lot of people took for granted. We've seen the limitations of international institutions, the fragility of alliances, and the reemergence of competition between major powers.
It's like a wake-up call, isn't it? A reminder that the international order isn't as stable or unified as we thought it was. And what about the implications for Europe specifically? It seems like this conflict has put a lot of stress on the continent, both in terms of security and economics.
Absolutely. This conflict has forced European countries to face their own security weaknesses. They've had to reconsider how much they rely on Russian energy and figure out how to handle millions of Ukrainian refugees. We've seen defense spending go way up across Europe as countries try to strengthen their militaries in response to the threat they perceive from Russia.
So we're seeing a return to militarization in Europe, a shift in priorities towards defense and security.
In many ways, yes. And of course, this has implications for NATO. The alliance has been invigorated by this conflict, with members coming together to support Ukraine and reaffirming their commitment to collective defense.
So NATO has a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed sense of unity because of this shared threat. But hasn't this also increased tensions with Russia?
Definitely. Russia sees NATO expanding eastward as a direct threat to its security interests. So we're in this weird situation where the conflict has both made NATO stronger and increased tensions with Russia, creating a more volatile and unpredictable security situation in Europe.
It's a tough situation. And as you said before, this volatility is made even worse by the economic fallout from the conflict.
Right. The war has been rough on European economies, especially when it comes to energy prices. Europe's dependence on Russian gas has been exposed as a major weakness, and now countries are scrambling to diversify their energy sources and reduce their reliance on Moscow.
That's a huge task, and it's going to take time and a lot of investment. And while Europe is dealing with all of this, the conflict is also having a ripple effect on the global economy as a whole.
Absolutely. This energy crisis, combined with disruptions to global supply chains and the general uncertainty surrounding the conflict, has led to rising inflation, economic instability, and a general sense of anxiety around the world.
It's a cascading effect, isn't it? The conflict in Ukraine is destabilizing not only Europe, but the entire global economy.
You got it. And this economic instability is making existing social and political tensions worse in many countries. It's creating fertile ground for populism, nationalism, and extremism as people look for scapegoats and easy answers to complicated problems.
So it's not just about tanks and troops. It's about the erosion of trust, the fracturing of societies, and the rise of forces that threaten the core principles of democracy and the rule of law. This conflict shows us that instability in one part of the world can have consequences everywhere, impacting everything from gas prices to political discourse to the fabric of our societies.
You're absolutely right. This conflict is about much more than just territory or who has more influence. It's about fundamental values, about the kind of world we want to live in. It's a struggle between different visions of the future, different ideas about how to govern, and different interpretations of freedom and democracy.
That's a sobering thought. And it highlights how important it is to understand the deeper forces driving this conflict: the historical context, the ideological clashes, and the complex web of relationships that have led us to this point. Because only by grappling with those complexities can we hope to navigate the challenges ahead and work towards a more peaceful and just world. Speaking of navigating challenges, there's one more area I'd like to explore before we wrap things up.
What area would that be?
I'm really curious about the impact of this conflict on the global information environment. We've touched on competing narratives, but I want to dig deeper into the role of propaganda, disinformation, and the way information is being weaponized.
Yes. That's a crucial aspect of modern warfare. The battle for hearts and minds is just as important as the battle on the ground. In fact, you could argue that in this age of social media and instant communication, the information battlefield is even more critical than ever before.
Right, because whoever controls the story, whoever shapes how the public sees things, they gain a huge advantage. And this conflict is a perfect example of how information can be used as a weapon to manipulate people's perceptions, influence public opinion, and sow discord and division, both within countries and between nations.
We've been bombarded with propaganda from both sides, each trying to paint themselves as the good guys and demonize the other. They use carefully crafted messages, cherry-picked information, and emotional appeals to sway public opinion and gain support for their cause.
And it's not just propaganda coming from governments, right? We've also seen independent players get involved, like bloggers, influencers, and even regular people who are actively shaping and spreading information about the conflict, often with their own agendas and biases.
Definitely. The information landscape is complex and often chaotic, and social media has only made it worse, allowing misinformation to spread like wildfire and creating echo chambers where people mainly see information that reinforces what they already believe.
So we're constantly fighting against not only misinformation, but also our own biases. It's tough to step outside those echo chambers and consider different perspectives.
It is. But it's something we have to do if we want to be informed citizens and make good judgments. We need to participate in constructive dialogue and challenge our own assumptions. The ability to think critically, question what we see and hear, and seek out various sources of information has never been more important.
You're right. We need to be aware of how propaganda works, the subtle ways it can manipulate our emotions and shape how we see things. And we have to be careful about those who try to take advantage of our fears, our prejudices, or our desire for simple answers in a world that's anything but simple.
Exactly. Because the ultimate goal of propaganda is to control how we think, to limit our choices, and to undermine our ability to make decisions based on solid information. It's about eroding trust in institutions, creating division within societies, and ultimately manipulating people to serve the interests of those in power.
So, how do we navigate this tricky situation? How do we avoid being misled, manipulated, or brainwashed?
Well, it starts with developing critical thinking skills. We have to question everything, especially information coming from sources that have a reason to push a certain narrative.
So, being skeptical of sources, considering their potential biases, and being careful about information that sounds too good to be true or fits perfectly with our existing beliefs.
Exactly. We also need to be honest with ourselves about our own biases, recognizing that we all have preconceived notions that can affect how we interpret information.
It's about being self-aware, recognizing those areas where we might be more susceptible to manipulation or just wanting to confirm what we already believe.
Right. And it's about being willing to change our minds when we see new evidence, to have respectful discussions with people who have different viewpoints, and to constantly challenge our own assumptions and beliefs.
That's a tall order, isn't it? It takes constant vigilance, a commitment to intellectual honesty, and a willingness to have difficult conversations.
It does, but it's worth it. The alternative is to just passively absorb information, letting ourselves be manipulated by those who control the narrative, and giving up our agency to those who want to exploit us. In this age of information overload, the most powerful weapon we have is our ability to think for ourselves.
That's a great point. We need to be active participants in the information landscape, not just passive consumers. We need to develop that critical thinking mindset, engage in respectful dialogue, and be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases. Because in the end, the quality of our decisions, both as individuals and as a society, depends on the quality of information we consume and how we process it.
Couldn't agree more. It's about understanding that information is power, but it can also be used against us. And it's up to each of us to use that power responsibly, to inform ourselves, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to contribute to a more informed and engaged society.
You're absolutely right. It's about recognizing that information is power, but it can also be a weapon. And it's up to each of us to wield that weapon responsibly, to use it to inform ourselves, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to contribute to a more informed and engaged citizenry. It really makes you think about the future. We've talked about the geopolitical stuff, the economic fallout, the whole information war surrounding this conflict. But where does it all lead? What kind of world are we heading towards?
Yeah, that's the question everyone's asking, isn't it? I mean, we can't predict the future, but we can look at what's happening now and kind of get a sense of where things might go.
So what are you seeing that gives you clues about the future?
Well, one thing that really sticks out is this decline in trust in institutions. We're seeing it everywhere, not just in the countries directly involved in this conflict. People are becoming more and more skeptical of governments, the media, even international organizations.
Yeah, it's like people feel disillusioned, like they've lost touch with those in power. And with all the misinformation flying around and the influence of social media, it's hard to know what's true anymore, who to believe.
You nailed it. And this loss of trust, it has huge implications for democracy, for social cohesion, for how our societies function. When people lose faith in their institutions, it creates this void that can be filled by extreme ideologies, populist movements, or authoritarian leaders who offer simplistic solutions to very complex problems.
It's a vicious cycle, right? The loss of trust leads to instability, which then leads to even more loss of trust. And this instability is amplified by the economic problems we've talked about. Inequality, the rising cost of living, people worried about losing their jobs because of automation. It all creates this feeling of uncertainty and anxiety that makes people vulnerable to extreme rhetoric and narratives that divide us.
That's exactly right. And it's important to remember that these aren't problems specific to one country or region. They're global issues. We're seeing more nationalism, more protectionism, and a move away from globalization in many parts of the world.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. Down one path, there's a future with more cooperation, global solidarity, a shared effort to tackle these challenges together. But down the other path, there's fragmentation, conflict, countries turning inward and focusing only on their own interests.
Absolutely. And the choices we make today, individually and collectively, will determine which path we end up on. This conflict in Ukraine, as awful as it is, could be a wake-up call. It reminds us that peace is fragile, our world is interconnected, and we need to address these global challenges before they get out of hand.
So it's a call to action then, a call to engage in real dialogue, to find common ground, to rebuild trust, and to work together to create a future that's fairer and more sustainable for everyone.
You got it. It might seem overwhelming, but we can't afford to ignore it. The stakes are simply too high.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and got you thinking.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.